Hi everyone, thank you very much for coming out in the cold tonight. Thank you very much, Juha, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you, Natalie, for taking care of me. And I've written a long paper, I'm afraid. So I'll just go right in there and read it to you. And maybe we can talk about it afterwards. That's long player playing in the background, by the way. The sonic is everything you can't see. It adds what isn't actually there. It is immersive, multidimensional, non-homogeneous openness. Acoustic imagination knows no boundaries. You can hear a wall or a room. You can create spaces that do not exist. Sound signals a breakdown, a welcome post-human turn away from language. Sound's coupling with computational art and culture is far from new. Yet the proliferation of the digital plays a key role in reconfiguring the relationship between sound, body, and machine, and as such, it is worth revisiting. The question of technology has largely been conceived in humanist terms. In Western thought, it is assumed that though we may not yet know what technology can do, one thing is certain: the validity of man. Technophile and evolutionary, lamenting and dystopian, sociopolitical, phenomenological, pessimist, progressivist, futurologist, or cataclysmic, but always assuming an intact self who has the authority to ask the questions, having taken its own existence as a given. Our culture's commonplace distinctions between biology and artificiality has rubbed off on the study of media and its substrates, for example, communication theories, cultural studies, and so on, where an anthropocentric interpretation of techno-human relations is gold standard. Crucially, as my argument goes, this position is spreading to sound studies. In the last 15 years or so, the sonic underdog finally gained momentum in the arts and humanities, as theorists and practitioners programmed, performed, manipulated, and philosophized the sounds of media technologies. From the social, political, and cultural conditions of sound and listening to the extra musical understanding of sound's materiality, the sonic turn, as Jim Drobnik named it, echoes an attempt to challenge the dominance of vision. This renewed interest in sound-based scholarship and the increasing significance of the acoustic as simultaneously a site for analysis, a medium for aesthetic engagement, and a model for theorization mirrors for Drobnik W.J.T. Mitchell's articulation of a pictorial turn a decade earlier. Certainly, avant-garde musicians, artists, and writers turned to sound as the basis for theoretical reflection and aesthetic experimentation as early as the 1940s and 50s, or even earlier if we count the futurist movement. Yet there is undeniably a current boom in studying sound as what John Kiefer calls the new kid on the cultural block. This is evident from the increasing number of sonic conferences, journals, symposia, sound art shows, sound guest talks, and even prestigious art awards that had hitherto been the sole privilege of visual artists, such as the Turner Prize given to a sound installation for the first time in 2010 for Susan Phillips's Lowlands. Perhaps this ambiguity, not quite old, yet no longer new, is down to the fact that, as Michelle Hilmes puts it, the study of sound, hailed as an emerging field for the last 100 years, exhibits a strong tendency to remain that way, always emerging, never emerged. As sonic worlds change, so too have the conceptual approaches writers engineer to behold them. For example, Douglas Kahn, whose Noise, Water, Meat was seminal in inciting the sonic turn back in 1999, writes, "By sound, I mean sounds, voices, and orality, all that might fall within or touch on auditive phenomena, whether this involves actual sonic and auditive events or ideas about sound and listening. Sounds actually heard or heard in myth, sounds heard by everyone or imagined by one person alone, or sounds as they fuse with the sensorium as a whole." unquote. That was a quote. Michael Bull and Les Bach's 2003 anthology, The Auditory Cultural Reader, was about, quote, moving into sound and the opportunities provided by thinking with our ears, unquote. More recently, in Listening to Noise and Silence, Salome Vogelin claims that, in contrast to a detached viewing position, a philosophy of sound art necessitates participation, since it involves the listener as intersubjectively constituted in perception while producing the very thing he perceives. And in the Oxford Handbook of Sound Studies, Trevor Pinch and Karin Bisterfeld, I can never say that, situate sound theory as part of the rise of sensory studies, which looks at the relationship between the material embedding and multisensory mediation of modern sound. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the wide variety of sonic voices offered in the arts and the humanities. Nevertheless, it is symptomatic of a plethora of sound studies material that remains focused on our connections with and experience of the auditory world, accounting for the listener, the instrumentalist, the act of deep listening, and the creative possibilities of the soundscape. Many of these works have developed as a way of making sense of massive changes in culture and technology from an explicitly sonic standpoint. They constitute reactions to the primacy of Cartesian reason, showing ways of escaping the Western tendency to measure, calculate, and represent everything. They offer strategies for defending and resurrecting the nullified senses, like hearing, which must no longer surrender to the tyranny of ocular centrism. However, this resurgence of the auditory and belated recognition of sound as a valid academic object of study and art discipline is often in danger of fetishizing the sonic. In their eagerness to refute the idea that the modality of the visual is ineluctable, lovers of the sonic resort to the usual ideological separations between sound and image. Romanticizing sound goes against what Jonathan Stern warns us is just another little piece of the vibrating world. Although experimenting with the auditory has enabled the consideration of new modes of knowledge and experience, I propose that there is room for extending the experiment further. An overwhelming majority of works within sound studies, refreshing as they might be, cannot completely do away with a human-centered position. But what else might emerge from probing the sonic realm, which does not belong to a body as a quality or asset, and is not tied to a plane of action or attached to anything else outside itself? When all talk of chance, control, and intentionality subsides, what lies dormant in the silence? Perhaps the problem rests in assuming that the sonic is necessarily located within the perceived spatiotemporal sphere of the event. This approach confines both sound and event to an actual, or at best probable, state of affairs, leaving the less or non-anthropocentric aspects of the sonic event significantly unaccounted for. Yet there have been other schemas daring to go beyond the audiophile angle. Kojo Eshen's 1998 book, More Brilliant Than the Sun, sets the stage for an alternative, otherworldly sonic theory. The book is a machine for pushing, stretching, reversing, and mutating music events towards new levels of sonic potential. It presents a non-compiled profusion of names, tracks, sounds, lyrics, and sleeve notes, not as historical artifacts, but as audiovisual vectors, with a capacity to acquire a new function. As the author explains, it is born out of a time at the end of the 20th century when music is already more this is a quote, music is already more conceptual than it's ever been, pregnant with thought probes waiting to be activated, switched on, misused. I can hear myself really loudly. I hope it's not the same experience for you. More Brilliant Than the Sun unleashes the unknowable logic of sonic fiction. This, according to Eshen, is, quote, speculative theory embedded in science fiction reinterpreted as an analysis of the ongoing present, adding to that the extraction of concepts and using them as vehicles to get to somewhere new. It is an unconventional research method whose aim is to radicalize the speculative ghost in contemporary sound culture. If we accept that speculative thought and digital media have been a productive pair across cultural theory, technoculture, and cyber studies, at least since the mid-90s, then the sonic element would seem to fit and intensify the assemblage in promising ways. The virtualization of sound culture builds on the pre-existing world of the avant-garde and on the DIY culture of the PC as music studio, but pushes them further and goes beyond both. It involves mobilizing new levels of possibility space, invites concept manufacture, spawns new languages, and demonstrates, as Kojo Eshan puts it, an extreme indifference towards the human. Intertwined with the power of fictional spaces to unearth the secret life of things, the sonic or sonic fiction tells the untold tales of theory by directly tapping into the artifacts and events rather than settling for their cultural analysis. For Eshan, the idea is that the sonic book does not have to be historical. It could be a sonology of history. Again, that's a quote. Sometimes I forget to tell you that there are quotes. Not a contextualization of sound, but the generative principle, generating its own life forms, its own worldview, its own world audition. In other words, sonic fiction is indifferent to the logic of applying philosophy to read culture and ignores the tradition of historicizing the old methods. It goes to extremes to reject the culture of veneration, which assumes that all the important stories have been told and that we're left with nothing but reproducing them. It announces the end of the era of great men and creates its own non-feudal paradigms for thinking the world. Sonic fiction summons a body of work that on the surface seems to undertake an impossible task. Human thought acquiring non-human perspective. It investigates what happens when the virus of speculation contaminates thought, activating the impetus of an unlived reality, infusing the sonic event. It executes, according to Holger Schulze, a fundamental rupture by means of an altered sonic epistemology. Sonic fiction takes us further into the dark side of sonic culture. For Eshan, key moments can be found in dance music, rave culture, drug culture, quote, the idea of losing control, of losing sense, of being abducted, snatched away by sound, unquote. For Steve Goodman, the darkness subsists in the affective micropolitics of sonic warfare and demands a specifically tuned methodology, which he calls the ontology of vibrational force. As he discusses, the method involves deploying concepts that resonate strongest with sound, noise, music culture, and inserting them at weak spots in the history of Western philosophy. This, and I'm quoting him throughout here, where its dualism has been bruised, its ocular centrism blinded. This is theory under the dominion of sonic affect, sound coming to the rescue of thought rather than the other way around, forcing it to vibrate. Such a sonic intervention into thought drags us away from the socio-political and historical organization of sound toward the vicinity of a more unreal state where the boundaries between fiction and theory are provisional and utterly permeable. For me, drilling into the dark side of the sonic takes us deeper into the domain of rhythm. But rhythm in my work does not abide by the prevailing definitions and traditional usage across the various disciplines in which it operates. My approach taps into the complicated history of the term and its fate to live in paradox. The Greek definition of rhythmos signifies order of movement, and after Plato indicates a regular, recurring, and measured motion of time. That said, rhythm has commonly been associated with flow in the popular view, which wants it to derive from the word reo, meaning to flow, and Heraclitus' belief that everything flows, referring to the uninterrupted flux of matter. Hence, rhythm has been associated both with regularity and unpunctuated flow, symmetry and motion, as well as the confinement of movement and pause. In contemporary scholarship, rhythm is a concept, a property, a practice, and a method that crosses different fields of study. For instance, rhythm is a well-known concept in poetry studies used to establish the relationship between meter and meaning. It is a tool of analysis with which to rethink various themes, an element as well as a theory and pattern in writing and language, and a basic structure and aspect of music. In most cases, rhythm is seen as the organizer of time and movement and is primarily linked to a linear, chronological arrangement of events. It is because of its arguable regularity and continuity, in other words, by discerning what does not change, that rhythm enables predictions of what is to come. Looked at in this way, it is no more than a predetermined transaction between numbers, a programmable component destined to concretize and translate into motion, purely addressing the active and attentive zones of a body. And it's time for my slides. However, I'd like to suggest that rhythm, especially as it is manifested in micro-compositional techniques, sound art performance, and digital media practice, can indicate that there may be other approaches to space and time. For example, writing on microsound, Curtis Rhodes asserts that digital synthesis has made obvious that our understanding of auditory perception can be stretched to include barely perceptible, transient, even silent microsonic events, occurring too quickly to be grasped by the ordinary timescales and thresholds of perception. Time stretching and other microsonic tools such as cutting, splicing, scrambling, and warping offer a glimpse into an alternative experience of the here and now. These are going way too fast, by the way. Don't know what happened to them. These tools work at the boundaries of auditory phenomena, zooming in and out of multiple timescales, pointing to movements and undercurrents below the stratification of vibration into sound and of sound into the idealization of music. Additionally, sound art performances invite participants to enter dark, both audible and inaudible spaces, standing, sitting, or lying still in the pulsating darkness of a room. Participating bodies gradually pass into the changing space of the performance without actually moving. As vision, movement, and language start to become irrelevant, the body gets enveloped in a haze. Its sense of individuality starts to dissolve, and it's forced to find other ways of feeling the world. Similarly, new media artworks that often seem surprisingly immobile, still, and uneventful, from digital installation art to vibrational photography, can introduce our human timescales to a time that is not ours, is no longer, or does not yet exist. These instances point to uncertain gaps around the actual knowable sphere of sound. Yet the gaps do not pertain here to an empty vacuum, but to what is occupied by the as yet unknown zones of perception. The simultaneous digitalization, virtualization, and abstraction of rhythm, which sonic artworks today practically enable and conceptually encourage, demonstrate that chronology is in a constant state of disruption. Following rhythm to these humanly impossible time spaces exposes us to realities that cannot be contained in anything like an experience in the phenomenological sense. The concept of rhythm, detached from symmetry and the idea of counting linearly from one to many, can uncover heterogeneous encounters between the different elements that it engages, affective processes that are irreducible to units and hierarchies, such as the subordination of time to space. This all went wrong because it had to stop in the last slide, in fact, for atmosphere. So I'll do it manually. Affect, according to Brian Masumi, suggests an emptying of perception from conscious, cognized activity, revealing the ability of a body to feel in a vaguely sentient manner. Come on. That's what yeah. Unlike emotion, affect is unqualified and non-subjective, a felt thought or thinking feeling, something that impinges, I give up, upon a body too quickly to appear to have happened at all. Considering rhythm vis-a-vis affect probes the sonic event as an assemblage of sensations that outlive the space, time, and bodies that make up and experience them. Thus, in a way, my rhythm analytic approach wishes to account for what is left over, for the unintentional, unnameable, and unknowable forces along the periphery of sound. These may accompany the sonic, but do not necessarily emerge in actuality. I follow Deleuze in understanding sensation as an immediate visceral feeling that is unsusceptible to representation, enlarging perception of the event without belonging to a perceiving subject. In other words, my thesis is that rhythm may be one way humans have of accessing the formation of a ghostly or subterranean temporality lurking in the shadows of the actual event. I lost it. Oh yeah. Deleuze and Guattari, in their passage on the refrain, their vehicle for theorizing rhythm, suggest that the latter is an oscillatory constant that links together active moments, but is not itself the moment or milieu. As they explain, machinic bodies pass continuously from one milieu to another, tied together by a rhythmic resonance. For the philosophers of the virtual, difference or novelty is rhythmic, generated out of a vibrational anomaly in the spatial-temporal realm, and alluding to the constant manifestation of change. Rhythm, they state, is always in between. And here comes a quote. Between night and day, between that which is constructed and that which grows naturally, between mutations from the inorganic to the organic, from plant to animal, from animal to humankind, yet without this series constituting a progression. Equally, for the philosopher of art, Susan Langer, progression and sequence are problematic in conceptualizing aesthetic experience. In Feeling and Form, Langer draws on the idea that the musical and sonic arts make a space and time appear that was not there before. She calls this a virtual time or semblance. Pure sonic duration, she affirms, creates a directly lived experiential time, measurable only in terms of sensibilities and tensions. That is to say, what she calls a life of feeling. In Langer's philosophy, the main principle of the vital activity of all feeling is rhythm, whose function, she argues, has been consistently misunderstood and confined to the regular recurrence of events. For her, the experience of rhythm cannot be rendered discursively. It is indescribable and, what is more, non-subjective, since it belongs to the act itself. Langer's treatment of the notion brings it forth as a relation between tensions, this is a quote again, rather than as a matter of equal divisions of time, i.e. meter, showing us that there is no distance between events, only the building up of potential, she says, swelling the gap between them and turning it into resonance. Following these thinkers and their handling of rhythm prompts us to speculate on the occurrence of aesthetic zones that are dynamic, relational, multidimensional, never entirely perceptible or relatable to actual experience. These in turn might enable the disentanglement of the concept of aesthetics from its anthropocentric definition and its reworking according to the speculative modality. Speculative aesthetics entails a loosening of thought from the constraints of human phenomenality in order to engineer new domains of experience. It hints at the autonomous creativity of the sonic event and at a definition of aesthetics that departs from its modernist genesis, that is, from the study of solely sensory-related processes, the value of beauty, emotion, subjectivity, taste, originality, and so on. As Stephen Zagala explains in his essay, Aesthetics, A Place I've Never Seen, it is instead about an ethico-aesthetic paradigm that attempts to highlight a creative process alongside an ethic of experimentation, which breaks with the institutionalization of art in order to imply a power of emergence or artistry. Crucially, for my purposes here, excuse me, the speculative becoming of aesthetics allows the coexistence of concepts and affects with rhythm understood as occupying and germinating in the middle ground of their intersections. In keeping with this unlogic, we can theorize the notion of rhythm as belonging to the gap. Rhythm emerges as a middle force that occupies the distance between events, hinting that there is no empty space or void waiting to be filled by human perception. It resides between actualized sense perception and the abstract virtual sphere that encompasses it. It lays bare the vibration prior to becoming sensory action, sensed sensory action, and unearths what risks remaining hidden in the cuts of our perception. Rhythm is neither this nor that. It trembles between things, between artist and artwork, flesh and algorithm, abstraction and concreteness. It is the relation, the generative glue that synthesizes and connects them through immediacy, forming crossings and transmutations between seemingly unrelated parts. Contemporary media and sound artists working with invisible, inaudible, and barely sensible energies seem to bring forth this imperceptible yet resonant condition of the middle. There is a relatively recent body of mostly sound installation and performance work that moves from the purely, I've showed some of the works there, moves from the purely sonic to the abstract composition of asymmetrical, immeasurable vibrational fields. The practice brings forth the sonic event understood as a field of encounters and partialities, partially conscious and non-conscious bodies, biological and technological entities, discrete and continuous aesthetics, virtual and actual zones. The situations these projects effectuate can be thought of as no longer requiring the active participation of human perception or belonging to a cognitive subject. These events reshape our understanding of perception as potentially non-conscious, non-sensory, and emptied from lived time. Considered as only partially human, good, we didn't lose her. Considered as only partially human, the body is liberated from causal explanations and predetermined expectations of its links to technology. Instead of situating perception at the heart of receptive activity, rhythmic events expose the body as incomplete, hallucinatory, deprived, or defective, and relating to the world only contingently. Rhythm invites the analysis of a sonic event as facilitator of the not taken for granted dimensions of experience. An enabler of this fleeting moment we can barely perceive with the senses, endure in consciousness, or express through language, but which is vibrantly real in its effects. It registers the elusive side of the event, its rhythmicity, in other words, its precarious, inconceivable aspect. As my proposition goes, we can release rhythm from symmetry, linearity, and regularity by plugging it into the force of the artwork. As a concept and method, rhythm involves couplings between sonic fiction and speculative aesthetics to build a toolkit for probing unaccountable and unfinished sonic realities that elude the present and the presence of the human and say nothing about the artist or the philosopher's intentions. A rhythmic ontogenetics of this kind challenges the notion of reality as strictly corresponding to the total sum of sensed phenomena and brings forth the potency of a virtual sonology inseparable from our computational age. Additionally, thinking rhythmically might contribute towards acquiring an uncommon view of bodies and machines, widely understood to stretch only as far as our knowledge of them, and of nature, by and large considered as the given articulation of our scientific discourses, exposing them both, or all three, to alternative configurations. Even if this endeavor necessitates a risky engagement with uncertainty and a degree of disregard for the old models that dominate thought and practice, it seems a venture worth pursuing. Sonic artworks, microcompositions, and performances uncover another dimension of space-time, accompanying a project yet not necessarily experienced within its actual domain. Although sensory perception is not muted, and audible sound addresses the aware zones of a body, Connecting to this realm creates a feeling of something else enduring beyond what one might hear or recognize. The sonic or rhythmic event does not merely account for what is given, known, or consciously apprehended. Rather, it is preoccupied with intervening on unfamiliar, non-sensuous processes out of which something felt emerges. It is an abstract audio event after which sound can no longer be what we use to communicate and express ourselves, but emerges as autonomous, agential, and capable of enabling new modalities of thought and subjectivity. As I've attempted to sketch out in this talk, the sonic event inhabits a virtual space of rhythm, letting it continue to its open-ended future. It unveils the power of rhythm to indicate unpredictable change and amplify tension, rather than maintain harmony and balance. The sonic event becomes portal to another truth of space-time, teleporting us to what Kojo Eshen called the terra incognita of rhythm, this continent we have yet to land on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleni. I think I have to be mic'd up. For the viewers at home. Hello, YouTube. Hi, YouTube. Thank you so much for this very well choreographed poetic performance. I want to do that as well with playing with music.
Ah, good.
I'm staring at you now. This reminded me, or your, now I recognize what you said, the voice here is, we're in this corner where
I can kind of hear it, like the...
Your lecture...
It's pretty traumatic, shouting at yourself.
Yeah. Your I'm just going to keep calling it a performance. So shall we move here?
Yeah. Yes. Otherwise I'll turn my back to the audience.
I don't know, maybe 10 years ago I went to the Holland Festival in Amsterdam, to the Concertgebouw, to Gagaku performance, Japanese music. And it was a concert I wasn't prepared for, and it lasted for 3 hours. And it felt like it had no structure, and it just danced around, and it was very difficult to follow. And it was the most amazing musical performance I had experienced. It just felt like that.
Oh, I was afraid you were going to say that.
No, I'll be brutally honest. This is as difficult as it gets, but it's also probably as good as it gets. At least for me, with an obsession for rhythm and music, and not knowing but feeling, or not knowing but understanding, and that's the kind of art I'm interested in.
Yes.
And maybe 10 years later, I'll be able to understand and put into words why I thought it was good at the time.
Yes.
But for now, I'll just swim in this ignorant bliss.
No.
And with that, I hope somebody has a question. Otherwise, I have another anecdote.
Hi.
Well, there's some structure for them. So I take it you are, because I have spent quite a lot of time working with rhythm as a practitioner of dance and art.
Okay.
And obviously, how we think and move with rhythm changes profoundly in different parts of the world.
How? Sorry, say it again.
How we think and imagine.
Oh, how we think, yes.
Changes profoundly in different parts of the world. And
Absolutely.
the West is fantastically square.
Yes. As opposed to polyrhythmic.
Square.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
this obsession just returned to this,
Yes.
So
that's the point.
Taking the opportunity to assume that you're Greek.
Oh, yes.
Quite clearly.
Yes. Although that doesn't come into.
No, but there's a tradition there which
Maybe.
isn't as regular, as symmetrical.
Are you Greek as well?
No. I'm familiar.
Okay.
With.
There's a tradition.
In that whole area of click music as well. You have rhythms of 10, you have rhythms of 9.
Yes.
You think of rhythm in a completely different way.
Yeah.
So how did this influence your thinking?
A lot. That's a good point and a good question, because
We didn't lose her either.
no, we didn't lose her either. That's great. Yes, exactly, precisely, because yeah, like as you mentioned, there's polyrhythmic traditions. There's all kinds of different approaches which are much more interesting, non-Western approaches, and that comes into it because that's the whole problem. Like my whole problem with what Western thought, I suppose. Right? That's what I'm trying to get to with the fact that you know. And it has a lot to do with, goes hand in hand with the predominance of vision as well, and of the visual, as in that is much more important for us than hearing and than anything to do with sound, which is always secondary. So I don't directly engage with, like, this is more a kind of an ethnomusicological approach, which I find really interesting. But I don't engage with it directly in my work. But I think it's relevant because, as you say, it helps us. Yes, and it helps. Yeah, and it helps us kind of fight against the Western tradition, fight the power. So definitely, yeah. I think it's relevant. I haven't really looked. I remember looking into African polyrhythms and drumming and things like that when I was doing my research, but I didn't ever directly bring it into the book or my work, but it's totally relevant. It's out there in the cloud that was encompassing the work in an indirect, but very relevant. I'd be interested to hear what you do with rhythm as a dancer and as a. Maybe we can talk about that later.
Have you? I've found a question.
Go. Where was it?
Well, I'm always interested in the fact that you can't unhear, or you don't have earlids, and hearing is always on, and you can close your eyes and look away, but you can't really hear away when you're in the sound.
Yes.
Do you have, in your research or in your knowledge of this topic, have you found a kind of question, an answer to the question why vision is so much more, why vision controls so much whilst it's less than 100%, 180 degrees that we see, whilst we hear 360 degrees around us. We hear everything before, after, behind us, sides.
Yeah.
But still, vision is so much more important and dominant.
Yeah, I mean, there's already kind of been answers to that by, of course, Plato and then Descartes are to blame about that dominance of vision. I suppose they're the ones to blame about the dominance of vision, but it has, like that body-mind split, right? It's the question of the body-mind split, the mind vision, and therefore, contemplating the world, Plato's cave, and all these ideas that we need to go out of the shadows through our minds and not trust our senses and so on. So the body is always secondary. And then McLuhan says it's because of the Gutenberg galaxy, right? The printing press, that we learn to read in one way and to think, therefore, in one way, linear, beginning, middle, end. And perspective, painting, art, all that. He talks about, interestingly, that you mentioned about the tribal drums and acoustic space. And he says that we are actually returning, although he didn't live to see how much we are returning, in fact, through digital media and the internet, but he says that we are returning into that through electronic media, tribal space. Multi-dimensional, immersive, right in the middle of it, and so on. And I think that's, and Eric Davis has written a really good piece about cyberspace, acoustic cyberspace. Yeah, absolutely, drawing on that. So I think and this is the point in my research, I think, as well, that something does happen along the line, with the digitalization of rhythm, that enables us to conceptualize it differently, that enables it to become more abstract. But not in a technophile way, as in, kind of just a celebratory way, but in an interesting way. Rhythm comes to the forefront where it wasn't before, and therefore maybe that's why the acoustic and hearing and the ear have become much more important recently than at least that's my argument, than they used to be.
Jamie?
I was just wondering how you felt about the importance of agency within the experience of sonic artworks.
Of human agency?
Yes.
Because there are other agencies. That's my point. but when you say how important, what do you mean?
Like, sort of the experience of a sonic artwork, the ability to sort of...
Yeah. Well, my argument is that it's not so important.
Yeah. No,
I'm playing it down a lot. It's important.
Yes.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously it is important and it is interesting, and that's how it all begins. It's this experience of this immediate space of the body, again the body-mind split being challenged, and the body coming to the forefront. So I think it's really important. At the same time, I don't want it to stay in where my approach is not. I don't want it to be confined in this kind of phenomenological, idea that it's human-centered, or that it's human-driven, or that that it kind of, if the human is that the human, Mark Hansen, for example, I suggest that if the human isn't there to experience it, to bring it into like the actual space, then it doesn't have any substance. It's not material. It's just. And my argument kind of goes against that, allowing other types of agencies to come through. But yeah, so it is important because we are able to go somewhere else with it, away from the split. But it shouldn't be the new focus or the new idealization or the new kind of fetish of anthropocentrism. Thank you.
I was just thinking about that there are complications when we think of human-centered as well. There are complications in what we define as human.
Yes, exactly. What is human, right? Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. And the non-human elements in it. How can you? Yeah,
and the human.
We are unable. Yes,
often
of the definition.
The split.
Yeah.
Itself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. It's like the other question: what is real? Right? these two. What is human? What is real? It's impossible to say.
This room seems pretty real, Mr. in the back.
Oh well.
It was really interesting. It reminded me a bit of the sort of object-oriented ontology stuff, Graham Palmer's speculative realism thing, that's sort of thinking around recently. And what I'm wondering about is there any connection to the fact that the digital media is sort of putting us in a position where it seems to be more about constant production, and so things that aren't really produced to be static. It's as though there's a constant production of material, and so that your production and your consumption is like an ongoing process rather than any individual entities. And I don't know if that sort of leads towards this connection to the idea of the rhythm being the kind of interstitial space between that, and then things becoming sort of autonomous because of that. I don't know.
Yeah. Just to say something about the Graham Harman bit, firstly. Just this idea, there's a lot of talk about speculative realism being like bringing all these things to the forth as if it's a new thing, but I'd like to slip a note here and say that there is a tradition of, speculative thought that goes way back. I mean, really, really way back, because I was telling someone the other day that it goes back to, Deleuze and Deleuzean studies, and at least 30 years back, and they said to me, they specialize in a different field, and they said to me, well, it goes back to the Middle Ages, in fact. So it goes way, way back. So yeah, I think that's important to note that, it's a speculative in this, and the speculative sort of Kojo Eshin was writing about, sonic fiction and speculation in the 90s as part of these experiments at the CCRU that again predates that. So I'm not referring to just detaching my position from any specific movements here. But the other question, is your question whether it's about the process rather than the product, or whether it's like it's an ongoing process? Because I suppose that there's no end to it.
Sort of process philosophy.
Yes, process philosophy, yeah.
That's what I'm kind of getting out of that.
again, I don't want to put that label on it.
What differentiates it from that kind of Bergson sort of Whitehead process of events as?
Yeah, so I mean, already between Bergson and Whitehead, you got quite some differences in relation to time and duration and so on. I think what my work definitely comes out of this kind of Deleuzian realm of thought. This is the stuff that that I was reading and I was working on when I was writing the book and so on. But the problem is that it's either or. In that sense, it's either it's that for Bergson, continuity, duration, smoothness, like never ending is everything. There doesn't seem to be much room, although Bergsonians would argue with me on that. It doesn't seem to be much room for the discrete, for the instant. And Bachelard, for example, Gaston Bachelard, he writes about the instant and discreteness and rhythm analysis, and he says that, he argues with Bergson, and he says it's all about the instant and the discrete. My approach, I think, is kind of trying to go in the middle of that. It's not either about time or space. That again is a split, is a dichotomy. It's not either or, continuous or discrete. I'm just trying to find a space where we can talk about the spatio-temporal, and we can talk about this idea of rhythm that enables their coexistence, like discrete continuity, And there are some practical examples of that, like Greg Lynn's architecture. He's a generative architect, and he works with the digital and with digital technologies and software, and he works with indiscreteness, with code, and kind of really edgy, rough, sharp processes, and yet the results are these blobs. He calls them blobs, these kind of smooth, continuous, soft aesthetics. And he's saying how, from that, through digitality, from that, you go to that. He's also influenced by Deleuze. So I think there are other ways. There are other ways. It doesn't have to be either or. There are other ways. I'm kind of heading for the middle.
We can kind of imagine what work looks like if you take that feeling and go to another practice area. So when you were talking, I was thinking about the Doppler effect, and a really important,
Yes.
a weird thing that people don't quite understand. And when you were talking, I was thinking, well, what would a visual arts point of reference be in terms of the Doppler effect? So I'm kind of thinking I can begin to understand where you're coming from with what you're talking about in terms of rhythm. I can begin to understand that by referring back to visual arts, which is kind of annoying and sorry. However, my way of understanding where you're coming from is by comparison and by coming at it from another direction.
No, that's great.
So I'm just thinking, well, what would a visual arts equivalent of the Doppler effect be? And then when you were talking about rhythm and about a constant rhythm, a constant stream of that, and I was then again thinking, what would Spotify for the visual arts be like? So
that's interesting. Yeah.
I'm
really
coming
interesting.
where you're coming from by thinking about other places.
No, that's
What
great.
would your observations about that be?
I think that's great, and that's really important, because in fact, I don't think rhythm belongs to the sonic, and that's like the point as well, kind of. It's like the sonic sound, music, sound. The sonic is like a portal. It's like a way in to get to it, but it doesn't belong to it. That's what I'm talking about. Not fetishizing the sonic, as in saying, okay, that's where it all is. That no more visual, no more vision, no more. It's again problematic. Put one sense in the hierarchy on top of everything else, and it's all about one thing. And rhythm, anyway, there's a lot of interesting work out there that deals with rhythm in very different ways, like rhythm with space, rhythm in architecture, rhythm in biology, rhythm in neuroscience, and all kinds of things. language, dance, all kinds of things that are different. So I think it's great that you did it.
Do you have an answer to that? A visual equivalent?
Yes, I was hoping you would have the visual equivalent.
I'm the
Don't count on
person
me.
whose sound is external because I'm deaf. And while you were talking, I was thinking, well, is the visual world external to me too? So while you were talking, I was kind of receding into a dark corner of not really feeling that involved in sound and not feeling that involved in visual art. So basically, I just talked myself into a corner.
That's fantastic. That's exactly where I wanted you to be. That was the point.
Sorry, you made me think of Olafur Eliasson's son at Tate, which is almost like a visual or vacuum almost, because it just changes your experience of time and duration.
Yes.
So it made me think of that.
It's a good,
when
it's a
you
good
were
one.
there
Yeah.
watching it, there's like a continuous flow of people going, oh look, you can see yourself reflected in the ceiling.
Yeah.
I had a question about the Western musical tradition, and I suppose what I was thinking about when you were talking is how rhythm as a portal to different kinds of consciousness has been a component part of ritual in any tradition, really throughout time and culture. Rhythm is along with sort of drugs and movement. It is kind of ways that we hack consciousness to access different kinds of understanding, and that for me continues through the Western musical tradition, from Bach through to Louis Andriessen. There's still an aspect to any of those types of art music that is still, the rhythmic aspects of those artworks is still connecting us to the ecstatic, it's still connecting us to visions of the divine, or certainly sort of things that run against the other types of meaning, whether it be through text or through a visual impression or through a liturgy that the work contains.
Yes.
And it seemed that what you were saying was that you were, what I heard was that you were sort of locating this idea of rhythm as a means of accessing different kinds of consciousness in contemporary sound art and in sonic work. And for me, I'm not sure that distinction exists. I think that it also applies to really any musical tradition in a way. There is an aspect of it that derives from the rhythmic practices of our bodies and sort of generations of tradition. And I just wondered, like, it's not so much that I disagree, it's more that I think it applies more broadly.
Sure. I think that's an excellent comment, an excellent point. So there's a risk in kind of seeming to argue that, here's where you're going to find rhythm, digital art, that's the only way to find that kind of rhythm that challenges meaning, consciousness, and so on and so forth, which I'm not. But I am saying, I do think that it doesn't apply to everything and everyone, otherwise I wouldn't have an enemy here. And the way it's been kind of theorized, understood, used, and practiced in relation to meter and the standardization of it, balance, harmony, and so on, is found in music throughout, and also the fact that it belongs to music. That you're talking only specifically about music, so it's become something that kind of is claimed by musicological studies, musicologists, musicians, and so on. So I suppose I'm trying to kind of detach it from that and do something else with it. The way into the digital art and sound art and computation art of the last kind of 20 years is important, because that's, like I said before, I think that something did happen with, like, for example, Kojo Eshen is talking about it in relation to techno, to, to, I said, rave culture, drug culture, and so on, where rhythm comes at the front for the first time, whereas it's usually at the back. And so something does happen with digitalization to it that I think is interesting to look at. And you can look at it in different examples and in different case studies. Mine is digital art installation. That's the thing that I did, and that's what I was into, and that's why it's kind of it's a vehicle, you know, to get to that. I'm not saying by any means that that's only where you'll find it, for sure. I think that's a good point that you're making. Exactly, you don't even need technology or computer. It doesn't have to be computational. But what I'm saying is that there, at a point in time, it's digitalization. It's kind of a virtualization. Is important. And I think there is also something between, from when Kojo writes about digital culture, rave culture, and electronic music and so on, it's very much an intense force kind of feeling on the body, right? It's something that you feel very intensely in the space that you are thinking of raves. It's the impact on the body, it hits you from all kinds of places and so on. Whereas that's why I kind of, mentioned the word virtualization, because there is then something. So that was in the 90s, a very intense experience. And then in the last 15 years or so, it has been another type of experience, of a rhythmic experience, that I try to tap into, which is much more of the silent kind. This is what I was talking about, the kind of uneventful, like not much happens yet, a lot happens to perception, a lot happens to the body, but it doesn't come out in a loud or way, as in rituals, in techno parties, in other ways. So I find that interesting. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Gentleman in the back.
Hi, thanks. I've really enjoyed that, and I find it particularly intriguing because my own sound, music, what you want to call it, practice, occupies a sort of similar territory, but from a slightly different angle in exploring the in-between. Naturality and actuality. So I find a lot of it really interesting, and I just wanted to ask sort of what I gathered from it. I haven't read the book, so it's possibly explained much more deeply in there. But was to what extent you're suggesting a reconfiguration of the term itself, rhythm, because ultimately, I mean, you say it must have an enemy, and I sort of wonder. To an extent, if actually...
Shouldn't have said that.
Yeah, no, I wonder if actually, because what struck me about it was its usefulness in the way you'd kind of reconfigured it as a critical tool, almost, for a way of moving between binaries and expressing the agency of that movement between binaries rather than necessarily a thing that is a fixed measure.
Yes.
Kind of implies that it wouldn't have an enemy.
Yes, you're right. But I've had a beer.
Yeah. So I'm on like, I guess I just wanted to ask that.
It's a fair point.
And also, it's to what level you kind of see it as a reconfiguration, because I guess ultimately sound can't exist without vibration, and vibration is essentially a rhythm.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's fantastic. I really want to find out what you do now.
He does some really cool stuff.
Sorry?
He does some really cool stuff.
He does really cool stuff. I can hear that. I got that. That's why I want to find out more about it. Which I shall later. But so, oh God, I forgot what I wanted to tell you now. Which was, yes, okay, so there isn't, you're absolutely right. It's not at all about an enemy, though every position kind of comes from somewhere and goes against something. In a way, has a problem. There's a problem, right? That you want to challenge. And I suppose the problem is this idea that with cultural texts, art objects, music culture, and so on, there's kind of been a tradition of philosophy or theory, analyzing and applying ideas onto them in order to make them important, right? In order to add value to them and interpret them and so on. So that kind of is an enemy in the sense that I follow that tradition I was talking about, Kojo and Steve and Goodman and so on. This other way of going at it, which is where does the thing itself take you? Where does the theory comes from the thing, from the sound, from the artwork, from the record, from. So that's where that kind of against something goes. It's like, okay, let's try another way. So that's the first part of the question, and the second was, sorry, I can't remember what the second was. How do we do that? I think I answered both. I want to think that I answered both questions.
I guess in reflection, there's still an element of that in it, and maybe it's just an
element of what?
Of theorization, of
yeah.
about a way of understanding that's
yes.
implicit in that application of a critical method of exploring something that is an experience outside of something unexpressed. Kind of thing.
There is, yes, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, you know, theory is not a bad thing. Theorizing isn't a bad thing. I think it's absolutely essential for it's a good thing. But there is the method of doing it and the way of approaching it. You know what I mean? Is different. So it's kind of like that vector that you follow into the unknown, rather than bringing meaning onto it from the outside. So at least that's the vision. To use the completely wrong word.
Can I just one quick question to follow up on that. I was just wondering who's native in this field. So the ones that don't read all of this, the ones that don't study this deeply, but the ones that understand it and before knowing, for instance, our children who grow up with this spectrality and being immersed in all of it.
Yeah.
What kind of people are native in this?
People, no, non-people.
Rhythmicity.
I don't know, because I'm not looking for that in terms of people, because I think that's one of the issues that I'm tackling is again this interpretation from the standpoint of the human. Like I said, without the human it doesn't exist, it's not there, and of perception and of what perception brings to it. So I don't know if I can answer that question, because that would be a question of perception, although I'm sure...
Yeah, it is, definitely, because it's a heightened sensibility that we're kind of returning to that primordial awareness.
Yes.
And I'm interested in that as an organizer, kind of what kind of work comes out of that, what kind of reception comes out of that.
No,
John,
that's interesting.
John
I just don't know if I have the answer. Yeah, John has the answer.
I think it's quite interesting when we hear or appear to hear sounds that we don't understand, that come from sources that we can't understand.
Oh, the
Doppler
Doppler
effect.
effect.
Add meaning to them in ways which are completely humanistic. So, for example, a good example of that is comet Philae, where signals from that apparently were processed by NASA and made into sound. Using quite a constructed method, and it's not really sound. They made it sound like sound.
Yes.
And then we've got things like sources of radio waves from space, which are then processed into. Well, actually, there are apparently radio waves, apparently signals, which apparently sound like some kind of code, coming from sources which are completely universal and natural, but we're making them human so that we can make meaning from them.
Yes.
And that's really interesting. So it's stuff coming from sources and concepts that we don't understand, but we're trying to add meaning using whatever.
There's also to add, to add to this, there's also, I think that's part of the effort to bring the imperceptible to perception, right? This is like there's something out there that we can't get to with our senses, and we need to use technology or whatever other ways in order to bring it to perception, which can be interesting in the result and in the process and in the equipment, even technologically interesting. But that's not the thing I'm talking about. It doesn't have to come to perception. This is my point. It doesn't have to come to perception in order for it to exist. Kind of, accompanies what you perceive. You can catch a glimpse of it. Again, you see how much visual language we have. I keep referring to visual language. But it doesn't necessarily have to actualize, like it doesn't have to, for it to.
I was thinking about the connection between the visual and the theorizing, that it tends to, I think it connects to sort of visual dominance, and that it tends to flatten and almost articulate a surface, describe a pattern, and in terms of rhythm,
Yes.
it's more of an articulation of space, and in relation to some of the discussions that have gone on here. When you talk about the instant and the continuity, in actual fact, I mean, regardless of whether the rhythm, if you go beyond the meter, the rhythm articulates the spaces in between as well, in ways that we don't really have a good language for.
Yes, absolutely.
But certainly
I agree.
in terms of written and spoken language,
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
relatively poor.
Yes, exactly. What is this thing that you can't quite express, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because you can't express
absolutely.
it,
It's
and
undeniable.
that's the point.
It undeniably exists.
Yes.
But it's not about articulating a surface.
Yes.
Describing. It's about a physicality.
Yeah.
Which has got to do with time and body undeniably.
Yes. We have to talk about about what you do soon after this. Yeah, I'm sure there are many crossings here.
May I ask you to join me in this rhythm and to thank Eleni?